Hi folks, in this session, module 2 of Christian Worldview, we're going to be talking about worldview formation. One of the most important recent works on worldview formation is this book by James K.A. Smith called Desiring the Kingdom. This book is an exploration from a Christian point of view of how a Christian worldview is formed. So we ask the question, how do we actually form our worldview? And we touched on this already a little bit with reference to Dilthey in the last module. But let's look at this in terms of a Christian worldview and from a Christian perspective. How do we form our worldview? Well, in the Western intellectual tradition, worldview formation is generally seen as an intellectual process. And I'm following here James Smith's sequence of argument, sort of basing this largely on what he says for this module. This begins really with Aristotle and is really affirmed in modern philosophy in Descartes. So according to Aristotle, all men by nature desire to know, and he understood human beings primarily as thinking things. So there was a kind of philosophical anthropology at work here in Aristotle that is also very much taken up by Descartes. Descartes' famous statement, "I think, therefore I am," which came from the sort of inquiry into knowledge and how do I know what's real. And Descartes felt, well, I can know for certain that I'm real because I think. And as simple as that is, it actually sort of affirmed this philosophical anthropology, a way of seeing human beings very much as thinking things. Well, the result, according to Smith, has been an understanding of education largely in terms of information. More specifically, the end of Christian education has been seen to be the dissemination and communication of Christian ideas rather than the formation of peculiar people. This is the issue that James K.A. Smith takes up really in his book. The example that he gives, he pulls a quote from Francis Beckworth. Francis Beckworth says, "What we mean is that the Christian faith is a philosophical tapestry of interdependent ideas, principles and metaphysical claims that are derived from the Hebrew Christian scriptures, as well as creeds, theologies, communities, ethical norms and institutions that have flourished under the authority of these writings. These beliefs are not merely utterances of private religious devotion, but are propositions whose proponents claim accurately instruct us on the nature of the universe, human persons, our relationship with God, human communities, and the moral life." So that's the kind of understanding of worldview and how worldview formation works that James K.A. Smith is trying to correct. In this account, a worldview is constructed as a system of ideas. So the last quote, this kind of popular way of thinking that James Smith is out to correct, construes a worldview as a system of ideas. The Christian faith, in a sense, is understood as a set of doctrines that are to be known and believed. And the goal, of course, is to be correct thinking. On this account, a human person is merely a container of ideas, a mind in a body. But what if, James Smith asks, but what if that is actually only a small slice of who we are? And what if that's not even the most important part? David Norgel says, as the image and likeness of God, people are animated subjectively from the core and throughout their being by that primary faculty of thought, affectation, and will, which the Bible calls the heart. So really in Scripture, the heart is primary. In Hebraic thought, the heart is comprehensive in its operations in human beings as the seat of the intellectual life. Proverbs 2:10, for wisdom will enter your heart. Proverbs 14:33, wisdom reposes in the heart of the discerning. Daniel 10:12, and he said to me, fear not, Daniel, from the first day that you set your heart to understand and humbled yourself before your God, your words have been heard. So first of all, the heart is central to the intellectual life, according to Hebraic thought. And it's also central to the affective life. Exodus 4:14, behold, he is coming out to meet you, and when he sees you, he will be glad in his heart, said of Aaron there. In Psalm 13 verse 2, how long must I have sorrow in my heart? So there's very much this affective, it's the center of the affections. It's also really the seat of all of our decisions. Judges 5:15, among the clans of Reuben, there were great searchings of heart. 1 Chronicles 29, keep forever such purposes and thoughts in the hearts of your people and direct their hearts towards you. Proverbs 16, the plans of the heart belong to man. So it's the seat of the heart is the seat of the intellectual life, the affections, but also the decisions that we make. And then, of course, ultimately the religious life. The heart is central. Deuteronomy 6:5 and 6, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart. These words that I command you today shall be on your heart. 2 Chronicles 16, for the eyes of the Lord run to and fro to give strong support to those whose heart is blameless towards him. And Ezekiel 14, Son of man, these men have taken their idols into their hearts. To know a person's heart, therefore, is to know the actual person. It is the mirror image of a man or a woman. Proverbs 27, as in water face reflects face, so the heart of man reflects man. And then God is above all concerned with our hearts, for our lives flow from the orientation of our hearts. Deuteronomy 6 verse 4 to 6 again, hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. And these commandments I give you to be upon your hearts. And also Deuteronomy 26 verse 16, this day the Lord your God commands you to do these statutes and rules. You shall therefore be careful to do them with all your heart and with all your soul. So it's not just enough just to enact certain things. It's got to be from the heart. And in fact, the perspective is that our actions ultimately do actually come from the orientation of our hearts. Proverbs 4:23, watch over your heart with all diligence, for from it flows the springs of life. Ezekiel 36, of course, the great promise of the new covenant is God says, I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit in you. The 150 or so uses of the heart in the New Testament demonstrate that it is, according to the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament, the main organ of psychic and spiritual life, the place in man at which God bears witness to himself. The whole of the inner being of man in contrast to his external side, the one center in man to which God turns, in which the religious life is rooted, which determines moral conduct. According to the various New Testament authors, the heart is the psychic center of also the human affections, Matthew 22. And he said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. Quoting, of course, from Deuteronomy. John 14, let not your hearts be troubled. 2 Corinthians 2, for I wrote to you out of much affliction, much anguish of heart. These are just examples of usage, that this idea of the heart is the psychic center of the human affections. Then also of the spiritual life. Acts 8, your heart is not right before God. Romans 2, but a Jew is one inwardly, and circumcision is a matter of the heart, by spirit, not by the letter. 2 Corinthians 3, you are a letter from Christ delivered by us, written not with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God, not on tablets of stone, but on tablets of human hearts. So it's the psychic centre of the spiritual life. And then also of the intellect and the will. Romans 1:21, for although they knew God, they did not honour him as God, nor give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. 2 Corinthians 9, each one must give as he has decided in his heart. It's very much the centre of the will. Hebrews 4, discerning the thoughts and intentions of the heart. Thoughts and intentions coming from the heart there. The New Testament authors also emphasize the centrality of the heart for living life the way God wants. Matthew 6:19, do not store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where moths and vermin destroy, where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, and so forth. For he goes on and says, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And then, of course, in Luke 6, no good tree bears bad fruit, nor does a bad tree bear good fruit. Each tree is recognized by its own fruit. People do not pick figs from thorn bushes or grapes from briars. A good man brings good things out of the good stored up in his heart. In the New Testament, the main problem with humanity that needs to be overcome is a problem with the heart, and there are plenty of references from this. For example, Matthew 13, Jesus says, for this people's heart has become callous. They hardly hear with their ears, and they have closed their eyes. And so the closing of the eyes and the blocking of the ears comes actually from a state of the heart. And then, for example, in Romans chapter 10, if you declare with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. So faith there actually is seen as not primarily intellectual thing about intellectual assent, but again an attitude of the heart. Jonathan Edwards famously said, the famous American theologian, who will deny that true religion consists in great measure in vigorous and lively actings of the inclination and will of the soul, or the fervent exercises of the heart. The heart is central to the Christian faith. According to Kierkegaard, a human being is an existing spirit, a process of becoming. We are pure intentionality, and this is something that Heidegger developed on in Kierkegaard. This idea that a human being, the way that we sort of experience ourselves in this sense is as a pure flow of intentionality. We are always disposed towards reality. We're not just passive. We're never just passive. We are constant activity, not primarily mental activity, but an activity of pure intentionality. And so Kierkegaard, according to Kierkegaard, for human beings, objectivity is impossible because we are always directed by our subjective standpoint, the attitude of our hearts, the bearing of our hearts. And so, according to Kierkegaard, our goal must be the attainment of the right kind of subjectivity. According to Heidegger, we don't think about the world of objects. Rather, we are involved with the world. The world is the environment in which we swim, not a picture that we look at as distant observers. We have an intentional connection with the world. It's not detached. It's in the sense that perhaps Descartes thought he could be, asking abstract questions about the world out there. No, we're not detached. That's an artificial way of thinking about our relationship with the world. We are always related to the world with a heart connection. It's a connection of desire and care. We never just think about the world. We always care. We have some heart disposition towards the world. What did the originators of worldview accidentally stumble upon, says Norgal in his book Worldview? What were they unintentionally identifying about humankind when they invented this notion, that is the notion of worldview? I propose, he says, that they were putting their finger in an adequate, though incomplete way, on the biblical understanding of the pivotal nature and function of the heart in human experience. What the heart is and does in a biblical way is what the philosophers were getting at unconsciously in coining the term worldview. So spiritual formation then is largely about cultivating a rightly oriented heart, to get back to James K.A. Smith's argument. Spiritual formation is largely about cultivating a rightly oriented heart. He says then, what if education, including higher education, is not primarily about the absorption of ideas and information, but about the formation of hearts and desires? We need, he says, a non-reductionistic understanding of human persons as embodied agents of desire or love. Now, James Smith's argument here in Desiring the Kingdom is a classic example of the application of a Christian worldview to a particular field. And of course, this is one of the projects for your assessment, is to apply a Christian worldview to a particular field. And of course, he's concerned with education, but I think this is a really good example of applying a Christian worldview to a certain field. James Smith goes on to say, we are essentially and ultimately desiring animals, which is simply to say that we are essentially and ultimately lovers. We are talking about the ultimate loves, that to which we are fundamentally oriented, that which governs our vision of the good life, what shapes and molds our being in the world. He uses the idea from Heidegger there. In other words, what we desire above all else, the ultimate desire that shapes and positions and makes sense of all our penultimate desires and actions, our ultimate love, is what we worship. It's not what I think that shapes my life from the bottom up. It's what I desire, what I love, that animates my passion.
One of the odd things is the extent to which
We are guided by something more like pictures than abstract ideas, according to Smith. A picture of what we think it looks like for us to live well, and that picture then governs and shapes our motives, our decisions, and our actions. The imagination, Smith argues, is crucial to the process of knowing, and hence forms a part of the religious a priori. The a priori is the sort of the innate conditions for knowledge. God speaks to our imaginations in picture language that communicates what he wants to say to us. We are so prone, Smith says, to associating education with the cognitive stuff of ideas that it's difficult for us to imagine education as a more formative, affective matter. Our imaginations get stuck in a rut, and it becomes difficult to get out of them, to imagine things differently. When that happens, theoretical dissertations aren't effective in destabilizing these habits of imagination. To jolt the imagination, we need more affective pictures. Education, then, he says, is the formation of desires and imagination that creates a certain kind of person who is part of a certain kind of people. The telos, he continues, or the end to which our love is aimed, is not a list of ideas or propositions or doctrines. It's not a list of abstract, disembodied concepts or values. Rather, the reason that this vision of the good life moves us is because it is more affective, sensible. It's even an aesthetic picture of what the good life looks like. A vision of the good life captures our hearts and imaginations, not by providing a set of rules or ideas, but by painting a picture of what it looks like for us to flourish and live well. This is why pictures are communicated most powerfully in stories, legends, myths, plays, novels, and films, rather than dissertations, messages, or monographs. And of course, a classic example here from the film Schindler's List, the story of Oskar Schindler, who goes on this journey from being a fairly greedy, self-centered man to actually saving thousands of lives. And it's a classic picture of someone who discovers what it means to be good. It's a very compelling display of that. James Smith goes on to say, how are right dispositions formed? Where do these inclinations come from? First, he says, as we've already suggested, an orientation towards a particular vision of the good life becomes embedded in our dispositions or adaptive unconscious by being pictured in concrete, alluring ways that attract us at a non-cognitive level. By pictures of the good life, I mean aesthetic articulations of human flourishing as found in images, stories, and films, as well as advertisements, commercials, and sitcoms. Such pictures appeal to our adaptive unconscious because they traffic in the stuff of embodiment and affectivity. Stories seep into us and stay there and haunt us, more than a report of the facts. Alistair McGrath, in his book Narrative Apologetics, says there is a danger that apologetics becomes fixated on questions about historical reliability of the Bible, and in doing so fails to set out its powerful vision of truth, beauty, and goodness. To offer a historical explanation of an event is to tell its story, thus providing a narrative structure that allows beliefs, actions, and attitudes to be related to one another in a meaningful way. This kind of narrative makes history both intelligible and interesting by providing a framework of connection between motives, events, circumstances, and contingencies. So again, McGrath is arguing that we need to appeal to people's imaginations, draw them into this picture of truth, beauty, and goodness. Theologians have tended to see truth, beauty, and goodness as different aspects of the same thing, really. And so rather than just abstracting truth, you can access truth through beauty and through pictures of goodness. I think that's, and essentially that's what he's arguing. Let's not just do this abstract apologetics, arguing over ideas. Let's show people a sort of our vision of beauty and goodness as depicted primarily in our stories, and our testimonies, as well as the stories of the Bible. James Smith goes on to say, in addition, habits are inscribed in our hearts through bodily practices and rituals that train the heart, as it were, to desire certain ends. There is a non-cognitive sort of training, a kind of education that is shaping us, often without our realization. Different kinds of material practices infuse non-cognitive dispositions and skills in us through ritual and repetition, precisely because our hearts, side of habits, are so closely tethered to our bodies. The senses are portals to the heart, and thus the body is a channel to our core dispositions and identity. Over time, rituals and practices, often in tandem with aesthetic phenomena like pictures and stories, mold and shape our precognitive disposition to the world by training our desires. So it's actually forming a worldview by doing things, not just by thinking things. So you've got to, it's the practice of worship and the practice of prayer, particularly corporate worship. It's the liturgies of corporate worship, the things that we do together. It's the physical practices that help to ingrain a worldview and shape our hearts. So there are two really main aspects that Smith has been pointing to that are actually crucial for the development of a Christian worldview. He's talked about practices, and a lot of his book, Desiring the Kingdom, focuses particularly on spiritual practices of worship. This is something that I think is I think it's a really valid point. It's important to recognize that just sitting around thinking about things actually doesn't really it doesn't cultivate the kind of knowledge, that spiritual knowledge through which we know God. It's actually practices of worship. That's what he means by liturgy. He means whatever form our worship takes, our corporate worship takes, that it's the practice of worship in all its different forms, the practice of prayer. It's things like getting together and whatever it is that we do together, even things like pilgrimage. There are those historical practices like pilgrimage, even a practice like being silent, sitting in silence together with other people. It's a practice, something that we do in our church very regularly. Even something like that is a way of training the mind and the heart. So these liturgies are very key. It's actually doing things that cultivate a certain way of knowing that is beyond just intellectual sort of analysis. But then also there are the various art forms that cultivate a Christian imagination. And this is, where the arts play a really important role. They can play an important role, of course, in worship, but it's really the Christian imagination, one might even say, has been really cultivated even mainly by the arts. It's by imaginative productions. Some examples here are, the works of Giotto that really helped people think about Jesus differently, as Giotto created these very fleshy human Christ who sort of was very much among the poor. It's the Christ of the people, and his paintings actually helped people to still use the classic sort of iconography. He's here in the top. That's his painting in the top right hand corner. Still use the traditional sort of iconography in many respects, but depicted Christ in very human terms. And in some ways, Giotto really brought Jesus back to the people. He painted the first nativity scenes, for example, with the baby Jesus amongst the animals and the shepherds, the lower classes, and so forth. So, and that helped people imagine Jesus differently. Dante's Inferno, another classic example of how, his appealing to the imagination about heaven and hell, for better or for worse, I may say, in this case, perhaps, somewhat for the worse, sort of really deeply affected Dante's work, deeply affected, Christian thought, and really created something of a preoccupation with hell. We see the scene of little fragment of the scene of judgment there from Michelangelo's painting in the Sistine Chapel. Classic film, The Ten Commandments, really captured the imaginations of a generation when that film was made. There's Johann Sebastian Bach. His work, his compositions are just really important for exploring this aesthetic dimension of spiritual experience. It's a whole other topic there. Works of Caravaggio, again, really brought a lot of biblical stories to life. And of course then famously Pilgrim's Progress, another classic piece of Christian literature, appealing to the Christian imagination and sort of depicting life as a sort of pilgrimage to the holy city. Well, that concludes our session on worldview formation, and that's given you a lot of things to think about, as well as a good example from James K.A. Smith's book on how to apply a Christian worldview to a particular area. And he's particularly concerned, as I said, about education and spiritual formation. In our next session, we're going to begin to look at comparative worldviews.